At 6:12 in the morning, on a Tuesday that seemed like any other, a man worth $3.7 billion stood in his driveway, briefcase in hand, staring at the one person who had never once questioned him in 14 years, his driver, a man who earned $22 an hour, a man who had opened that car door every single morning without fail, rain or shine, sickness or health. But today, his hand wasn't on the handle. It was raised, palm out, blocking the way. And in a voice so quiet it barely broke the dawn silence, he said something that would unravel an empire built over 3 decades. He said, "Sir, you cannot go today." Not, "Sir, we have a problem." Not, "Sir, can we talk?" Just, "You cannot go." The billionaire laughed. Then he got angry. Then he got scared. Because in that moment, he realized something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The poorest man in his world knew something about him that he didn't even know about himself. And what he was about to discover in the next 24 hours would destroy everything he thought he understood about loyalty, power, and the people we ignore every single day. So what did the driver know? Why would a man with nothing risk everything to stop a man with everything from doing what he did every single day? Was this a warning? A threat? An act of love? Or an act of revenge? And here's the question that kept investigators, journalists, and eventually millions of people awake at night. If someone you barely noticed tried to stop you from walking into disaster, would you listen? Or would you do what most of us do? Push past them, call them crazy, fire them on the spot, and keep moving? Because that's what almost happened. The billionaire almost fired him right there in the driveway. Almost called security. Almost ruined the life of the only person trying to save his. This is not a story about money. It's about the kind of silence that builds up over years, until it finally cracks. And when it does, the sound it makes changes everything. You're about to hear that sound. His name, for the purpose of this story, was Richard Alcott. And if you'd Googled him 3 months before that morning, you'd have found exactly what he wanted you to find. Philanthropist, innovator, self-made titan of the logistics industry. A man who turned a single delivery van into a fleet of 18,000 vehicles operating in 47 countries. He'd been on magazine covers, keynote stages, charity galas. His company, Alcott Global Transport, moved 500 million packages a year. Prescription medicine to rural hospitals, food to disaster zones, documents that decided elections, trials, lives. People trusted him. Governments contracted him. His competitors feared him. But here's what those articles didn't tell you. Richard hadn't actually driven one of his own trucks in 28 years. He hadn't loaded a box, hadn't worked a graveyard shift in a warehouse, hadn't sat in traffic for 6 hours because a route was double booked and no one cared enough to fix it. He'd built an empire, yes, but somewhere along the way, he'd stopped seeing the people inside of it. Not out of cruelty, just out of distance. The higher you climb, the smaller people look. That's not a metaphor. That's geometry. And Richard had climbed very, very high. He had 3 children he barely saw, a wife he spoke to mostly through assistants, a calendar managed by 4 people, and 1 driver who'd been with him for 14 years and whose first name he'd only learned 5 years in. That driver's name was Martin. Martin Cole was 61 years old, the morning he stopped Richard from going to work. He had worked for Alcott Global Transport for 14 years, the last 11 as Richard's personal driver. Before that, He'd been a long-haul trucker for 32 years. He knew highways better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. He knew when a load was packed wrong, just by the way a truck leaned. He knew which routes had the most accidents, which depots had the worst managers, which drivers were getting squeezed so hard they'd started skipping sleep. And he knew something else. He knew how to stay invisible. Martin was the kind of man people looked past. Average height, thinning gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses. Drove the same blue sedan on his days off that he'd bought used in 2009. Lived in a one-bedroom apartment in a part of town where rent hadn't gone up in 15 years because nothing else had either. His wife, Clara, had died of cancer 6 years earlier. They hadn't been able to afford the treatment that might have saved her. Not because Martin didn't work hard, but because hard work and survival aren't always related. He didn't talk about that. He didn't talk much at all. But he listened, and he watched. For 14 years, Martin had been in that car with Richard. He'd heard every phone call Richard didn't think mattered enough to step outside for. Every argument with his CFO, every whispered negotiation, every celebration, every curse, every careless remark. Martin had sat 3 feet away while Richard's empire was built, threatened, expanded, defended. And no one ever asked him what he thought. No one ever wondered if he understood. But Martin understood plenty. He understood that Richard's company moved more than packages. He understood that some of those late-night calls weren't about logistics. And he understood that for the last 8 months, something had been quietly, methodically going very, very wrong. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My mom said I can't hit 1,000 subscribers before today ends. Subscribe, and let's prove her wrong. That Tuesday morning was supposed to be the most important day of Richard's professional life. The board was meeting at 9 a.m. to vote on a merger with a European conglomerate, a deal worth $4.2 billion, a deal that would double the size of Alcott Global overnight. Richard had been preparing for 6 months. He had presentations, projections, legal teams on standby. He'd barely slept in a week. This was his legacy moment, the thing that would put his name in history books, not just business journals. So, when he walked out of his house at 6:10 that morning and saw Martin standing beside the car with his hands at his sides instead of opening the door, Richard's first reaction wasn't concern. It was irritation. He checked his watch. He had exactly 42 minutes to get across the city to his office, review final notes, and get into that boardroom ready to close the deal of his life. He didn't have time for whatever this was. "Martin, let's go," he said, not even looking up from his phone. Martin didn't move. Richard stopped walking. He looked up, and that's when he saw Martin's face. It wasn't defiant. It wasn't angry. It was something worse. It was afraid. "Sir," Martin said quietly, "you cannot go today." Richard stared at him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Richard laughed. A short, confused laugh. "What are you talking about? Open the door." "I can't do that, sir." "Martin, I don't have time for games. Open the door. Now." "If you go to that building today," Martin said, his voice shaking slightly, but his eyes steady, "people are going to get hurt, and I can't let that happen." Richard's irritation flared into anger. "Are you threatening me?" "No, sir. I'm trying to stop something I should have stopped a long time ago." Richard pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered over the contact for his head of security. One call, and Martin would be gone. Arrested, probably. Blacklisted, definitely. But something in Martin's face made him pause. This wasn't a man looking for attention. This wasn't a man trying to shake him down. This was a man who looked like he'd been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally decided he couldn't carry it another step. "What are you talking about?" Richard asked, slower this time. Martin looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you know what's in those trucks, sir? The ones that leave Depot 73 every Thursday at 2 a.m.? Richard felt something cold move through his chest. Depot 73. He knew the name. It was one of their newer facilities, built 4 years ago on the outskirts of the city. Operated mostly third shift. He'd signed off on it but hadn't visited in at least 2 years. "It's a sorting hub," Richard said carefully. "That's what you're supposed to think," Martin said. Richard's hand tightened on his phone. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means I drove your CFO there 11 times in the last 8 months. Always after midnight. Always when you were traveling. And every time he met with people who don't work for you. People who don't work for anyone you'd want to know." Richard's heart was pounding now. His CFO, Daniel Frost, his right hand for 9 years, the man who'd structured the merger, the man who'd built half the systems that kept Alcott Global running. "You're lying." "I wish I was, sir." Martin reached into his jacket pocket, slowly. Richard flinched. But what Martin pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a small notebook. Old. Worn. The kind you'd buy at a dollar store. He held it out. Richard didn't take it. "What is that?" "Everything I saw. Everything I heard. Dates. Times. License plates. Names I managed to catch. I wrote it all down because I didn't know what else to do. I thought about going to the police, but I didn't know if they'd believe me. I thought about going to you, but I didn't know if you'd listen. So I just kept watching, kept writing. And then last night I heard something that made me realize I was out of time." Richard's voice came out quieter than he intended. "What did you hear?" Martin's face was pale. "Your CFO told someone on the phone that today was the day, that once the merger went through and the money moved, the trail would be buried so deep no one would ever find it, and that anyone who tried would be dealt with. Sir, I don't know what he's planning, but I know enough to know that if you walk into that building today, you're either part of it or you're in the way, and either way, you're not walking back out the same person." Richard stood there in his driveway, the early morning light turning everything pale and unreal, staring at a man he'd barely thought about for 14 years. A man who'd just told him his entire world might be a lie. His first instinct was to call Daniel, demand an explanation, but something stopped him. If Martin was wrong, he'd look like a paranoid fool. If Martin was right, calling Daniel would tip him off. Richard took the notebook. It was heavier than it looked. He opened it. The first page was dated 8 months ago. Martin's handwriting was careful, small, almost apologetic, like he was afraid the words themselves might cause damage. There were addresses, times, descriptions of people, snippets of overheard conversations, and running through it all, again and again, was one name, Daniel Frost. Richard felt his hands start to shake. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. his voice barely above a whisper. "I tried, sir, 3 times. You were always too busy, always about to get in a meeting or on a plane. I told myself I'd catch you when you had time. But you never did. So I kept watching, kept hoping I was wrong." Richard looked up at him. "And now? Now I'm out of time, and so are you." Richard made a decision. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Not to Daniel, not to security, to his lawyer. Then to someone he hadn't spoken to in years. A federal investigator he'd met at a charity event. Someone who owed him a favor. Someone who could move fast. By 7:15, 3 cars were parked outside Richard's house. By 7:45, Martin was sitting in Richard's study, walking federal agents through every page of that notebook. And by 8:30, when Richard was supposed to be walking into that boardroom, he was instead watching from a secure location as federal agents walked into Depot 73 with warrants. What they found inside Depot 73 would make national news within 6 hours. It wasn't a sorting hub. It was a smuggling operation. Not drugs, not weapons. Something worse in some ways. Medical supplies, stolen, diverted, relabeled, then sold at full price to hospitals and clinics that thought they were buying legitimate inventory. Insulin, chemotherapy drugs, EpiPens. The kinds of things people died without. Alcott Global's logistics network had been used to move these supplies across state lines, sometimes across borders, bypassing safety checks, expiration dates, proper storage. Some of the medication that ended up in rural hospitals was expired. Some was counterfeit. Some was diluted. People had gotten sick. Some had died. And Daniel Frost had been orchestrating the whole thing, skimming millions off the top, using shell companies buried so deep inside Alcott Global's structure that even internal audits had missed them. The merger was supposed to be the final step. Once Alcott Global absorbed the European company, Daniel's network would expand overseas. The money would become untraceable, and anyone who stumbled onto the truth would be drowned in paperwork, bureaucracy, and legal threats from one of the largest logistics companies in the world. Richard watched the news footage from his lawyer's office, his face blank, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair so hard his knuckles went white. He'd built this company, and someone had weaponized it, used it to hurt people, people who trusted the name on the side of the truck, people like Clara, Martin's wife, who'd died because they couldn't afford treatment. And now Richard understood. He understood why Martin had stopped him. Not to protect Richard, to protect everyone else. Over the next 3 days, the investigation expanded. 17 people were arrested. Daniel Frost was charged with fraud, racketeering, and manslaughter. The merger collapsed. Alcott Global's stock dropped 42% in a single day. Richard spent 72 hours in depositions, interviews, and legal briefings. He cooperated fully, turned over every document, every email, every record. The authorities cleared him of direct involvement. He genuinely hadn't known. But that didn't make him feel any better, because the question that kept him awake wasn't whether he'd broken the law. It was whether he'd failed, in a way that was worse. He'd built a company so big he couldn't see what was happening inside it. He'd trusted people without verifying. He'd ignored the quiet man in the front seat who'd tried to tell him something was wrong. On the 4th day, Richard asked his assistant to find Martin. It took 2 hours. Martin wasn't at home. He was at the hospital. Not because he was hurt, because he was visiting someone. A woman named Grace, 68 years old, grandmother of 4. She'd been admitted 3 weeks earlier with complications from diabetes medication that turned out to be counterfeit. Medication that had moved through Depot 73. Martin had seen her name in the news, recognized the neighborhood, and started visiting, bringing her magazines, sitting with her when her family couldn't. When Richard walked into that hospital room and saw Martin sitting beside her bed, reading aloud from a paperback novel, something inside him cracked. This man had saved his company, saved his reputation, maybe saved his life, and he was spending his afternoon reading to a stranger because he couldn't save his own wife, and he refused to let that happen to anyone else if he could help it. Richard waited in the hallway until Martin finished the chapter. When Martin stepped out and saw him, he looked startled. "Sir, I didn't know you were—" "I should have listened to you," Richard said. Martin shook his head. "You didn't know." "I should have known. That's the point. I built something so big I stopped being able to see it. And people died because of that." They stood there, in the fluorescent hospital hallway, 2 men from completely different worlds, connected by a moment that had saved one of them and broken the other. "Why did you do it?" Richard asked quietly. "Why did you risk everything to stop me?" Martin was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because 14 years ago, I tried to warn someone else, a manager at a warehouse I worked at. He was cutting corners, safety inspections, maintenance checks. I told his supervisor. Nothing happened. 2 months later, a loader collapsed, killed a kid, 23 years old, had a baby on the way." Martin's voice wavered. "I told myself, if I ever saw something like that again, I wouldn't stay quiet. Wouldn't wait for someone else to fix it. Clara used to say I was too quiet, that I let people walk all over me. Maybe she was right, but she also said that silence isn't peace. It's just delayed noise. And when it finally comes out, it's louder than if you'd spoken up in the first place." Richard felt something tight in his chest. I'm sorry about your wife." "So am I, sir. Every day." They stood there for another moment. Then Richard said, "I'm stepping down from the company. The board's meeting tomorrow to appoint an interim CEO. I'm staying on to help with the investigation, but after that, I'm done." Martin looked at him, surprised. "Sir, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do. Because you were right. I can't see what's happening anymore. And I can't fix what I can't see. But I can make sure the next person who runs this company actually listens to people like you." Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. He held it out. Martin didn't take it. "It's not a payoff," Richard said quietly. "It's a thank you and an apology for 14 years of not listening." Martin looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he took it. Not because he needed the money, though he did, but because refusing it felt like letting Richard off the hook. And Richard needed to carry this weight. They both did. 6 months later, Alcott Global Transport was operating under new leadership. Richard had resigned. Daniel Frost was awaiting trial. The company had settled lawsuits with 73 families, overhauled its logistics systems, installed independent oversight. It would take years to rebuild trust, maybe decades. Richard sold his house, donated most of his personal wealth to a fund for people harmed by medical fraud. He started working with a legal nonprofit that helped whistleblowers navigate retaliation. He wasn't doing it for redemption. He was doing it because he didn't know what else to do with the rest of his life. Martin kept driving, not for Richard. Richard didn't need a driver anymore. Martin took a job with a small medical transport company that moved patients who couldn't afford ambulances. The pay was less. The hours were worse. But the work felt right. And one evening, driving an elderly man to a dialysis appointment, Martin's passenger asked him if he'd heard about that big scandal with the logistics company. "I did," Martin said. "Crazy, right? Guy who blew the whistle must have been brave." Martin smiled a little, kept his eyes on the road, or just tired of being quiet. Here's what this story is really about. It's not about a billionaire or a driver. It's about proximity. About the people who are close enough to see the truth, but far enough down the ladder that no one thinks to ask them what they see. It's about the fact that the most dangerous thing in any organization, any relationship, any life, isn't malice. It's inattention. Richard didn't set out to hurt anyone. He just stopped looking, stopped listening, stopped noticing the person 3 feet away who was trying to tell him something. And because of that, people died. Here's the question this story should leave you with. Who are the people in your life that you're not listening to? Who are the Martins? The quiet ones. The ones who show up every day and do their jobs and never complain, and you don't even know their middle names. What do they see that you don't? And if they try to tell you, would you listen? Or would you do what Richard almost did? Laugh it off. Get angry. Call security. Because here's the truth. Most of us would. Most of us are too busy, too important, too sure we already know everything we need to know. Until the moment we don't. And by then, it's too late. So let me ask you this. Do you think Martin did the right thing? Do you think Richard deserved a second chance? And if you were in Martin's position, knowing what he knew, would you have had the courage to step in front of that car door? Or would you have stayed quiet, told yourself it wasn't your place, and let someone else deal with it? I want to know what you think. Drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever been the person who tried to speak up and no one listened. Or if you've been the person who didn't listen and wish you had. And if this story made you think, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more people willing to say the hard thing when it matters. Hit that subscribe button. Let's prove my mom wrong today. And if you want more stories like this, stories about people who did the right thing when it cost them everything, subscribe now. Because next time, we're talking about a teacher who lost her job for asking one question. And what happened next shocked an entire school district. Thanks for watching. And remember, silence isn't peace. It's just delayed noise.